Growing up, my parents did this thing that I liked at the time because it was just how we did things, but I kind of grew to hate it, and that was the Jeopardy Wheel of Fortune hour. Every night, like clockwork, I think it was 5 o'clock, if I remember correctly, maybe it was 6 o'clock, but every single night, 30 minutes of Jeopardy, 30 minutes of Wheel of Time, and you kind of saw a little bit of a pattern. Jeopardy would be, would have more of the smart contestants, and Wheel of Fortune would have more of the dumber contestants. And I hate to say it like that, but you had some of these people where all the letters would be filled in except for like maybe one, and they still couldn't figure it out. Meanwhile, on Jeopardy, they'd ask these hard questions I didn't even thought about asking, and they had the answer, and I was like, oh man, well, okay. And there was this thing that always happened on Wheel of Fortune that irritated the tar out of me. And that's, they would have most of the letters up in the dill, and they'd start buying vowels. This didn't bother anybody else, but it drove me mad because that's money that you're taking home with you, and now you're wasting it. There's no reason to be buying vowels. Roll, get some more money, and get some consonants up there, And people obviously aren't as passionate about this as I am, but the issue that I saw is that they didn't have any forethought. And that was the thing that was bothering me. They were spending this money to buy the vowels. If they would have just waited or guessed, they would have been better off. And I'm one of those people that I tend to be very intentional with my finances. And so when I see other people not be intentional with their finances, it kind of irks me. You know what I mean? Maybe you could relate if you have kids or grandkids, and they do something or spend money, and you're thinking, what are you doing? Not unlike what Aldo was telling me before service. And you get this idea that they're ruining their lives. My kids or my grandkids, they're ruining their lives. If you've ever felt that, you kind of know exactly what I'm talking about. And so we're going to look at a parable that talks about this. And the message today is a rich legacy of foolishness. Because, well, let's move on, and you'll kind of see how that fits in. Luke 12 is where we're gonna read from today. It says this: when he told them a parable, a rich man's land was very productive. He thought to himself, what should I do since I don't have anywhere to store my crops? I will do this, he said. I'll tear down my barns and build bigger ones and store all my grain and my goods there. Then I'd say to myself, you have many goods stored up for many years. Isn't that kind of weird how he's talking to himself? Self, you have many goods stored up. Take it easy, eat, drink, and enjoy yourself. That sounds good, doesn't it? He's worked hard, and now he's going to plan ahead. This is good. And he's worked hard all his life. Why shouldn't he have some years of pleasure, right? So all this sounds good to me. Then you get to verse 20, and you get a little bit of a curveball, something that the ancient audience would not be on board with what Jesus is saying. Because they, much like us, had this idea of, yeah, you should plan for the future, and yeah, if you have had a rough life, why not enjoy, a little bit of the end there, But then we get to verse 20, and Jesus throws in this curveball. But God said to him, you fool, huh? What? This very night your life is demanded of you, and the things you have prepared, whose will they be? Well, that doesn't really fit with how we like to do things there. And Jesus will oftentimes do this in those stories. He'll say these things, and then he'll say, oh, good. And you're thinking, what? Like we looked at this with the parable of the prodigal son, right? Where the ancient Jewish audience would have been like, why in the world are you enabling your son to act like that? Meanwhile, here, the exact same thing's happening. His audience is with him until he gets to the end, and then he loses them. What are you talking about, Jesus? And so we looked at last week. Let's kind of tie some ideas here. We've been looking at our legacies, our legacy for the last year, because this is our 100-year anniversary. So, legacy is a big part of that. And one thing we brought up last week is the idea that our legacy is what you are doing. It's not something you used to do. It's not something that, it's not that. Our legacy is what you are doing now. You don't live off the past. And the reason why our legacy is what you're doing now is because what you're doing now forms the future. What you're doing now, right now in your life, forms the future. So a good example of that is, if you don't take church seriously, you find reasons not to go and all that, you find that your kids don't see it as relevant. There's this kind of gradual thing where somebody will think that church is really important, then they'll have kids and they'll think, yeah, it's kind of important. And then they'll kind of, maybe not so important though as my dad thought it was. And their kids will say, why even go to church? It's a waste of time. See, and there's this kind of thing that happens. What I'm trying to say here is that what we do now is forming the future. What we give to now, what we live for now is forming the future. It changes the way that our kids will react. It changes the way that what things will happen in our world, all kinds of stuff. And it seems like it's not important when we're doing it, but everything that we're doing really does matter. And the second thing about what you're doing is it molds you. What you're doing in life has a way of molding you. For instance, I've told this story before of a woman who was faithful to her husband when her husband was not. Years passed, and she continued to be faithful to her cheating husband, year after year after year. And finally, she said this. She said, I'm better than my husband. I've never cheated. So, I'm going to cheat rather than getting a divorce, rather than continuing to stay faithful, any of those things. She could have done any number of things, but instead of that, she said, I'm going to keep on staying married, but I'm going to cheat on him. Well, what became of her? It changed her. She was no longer better than her husband because she started thinking different and acting different. She started cheating. So it means she became the thing that she hated. And another maybe a better example of that would be when you marry someone when you get older, right? They always tell you, wait till you're older to get married. Right? Okay, all right. But the problem with that is when you live by yourself, you get set in your ways. You know what I mean? You kind of know how you want things. You don't want people messing with things. This is where I put my shoes because I feel like it. I fold my laundry this way and I fold my towels this way because that's how I want to do it. When you get married, you got another person who they know their own ways of doing things. Well, if you wait till you're not, till you're old and mature enough, and then marry someone who's old and mature enough, you find that you have more headbutting because you have to learn to live with this person who's already set in their ways while you also are set in your ways. So the things you do, it molds you. And maybe a better way of saying this is that our actions become you. Actions become you. At the end of the day, it's not how you feel about something, it's what you do about it. Right? I can say I love my wife, I can feel all kinds of a way towards her, but if I'm not doing things to show that, is it really love? If I'm not coming home at the end of the day instead of going out drinking, is that really love? If I'm not staying faithful to her, is that really love? Can love be without some kind of an expression? Our actions become us. So let's hop down to verse 19. We already read it, but I think there's something here that we need to kind of tune into here to just kind of tie some ideas in. Then I'll say to myself, you have many goods stored up for many years. Take it easy, eat, drink, and enjoy yourself. See, he was doing exactly what we were talking about last week with his legacy. He thought his legacy was something he did yesterday. I've done great things yesterday. Look at what I did yesterday. It's good that I take it off and just because I've done so well in the past. And that's oftentimes what we think of our legacy. Look at this building that was built in my name. Look at the statue. But our legacy isn't something we used to do. It's something we are doing now. Your legacy is what you're doing now because it's molding you and it's changing things. So there's two things I think we need to kind of hit on that we brought up last week with the idea that we're going to answer it this week. The first thing is, does yesterday's victories not matter at all? If you're saying that legacy is simply what you are doing now, does that mean that yesterday doesn't matter? Because, hey, I did great things yesterday. Does that not matter anymore? Does it not count? And I think the answer to that is in verse 16. It says here, then he told them a parable of rich man's land was very productive. How was it productive? Was it not productive because of what he did yesterday? Maybe another way of saying that is today's productivity comes from yesterday's victories. Yes, the past absolutely does matter. We are productive now because of then. And oftentimes, we'll get in a place of coasting in church culture. We did really good. We had a vision yesterday. We did really good. We reached people. We impacted their kids. We impacted their families. So you just kind of coast on that. I mean, COVID was a great example of this. It changed everything. And anything you did pre-COVID didn't seem to matter anymore. Everybody just kind of changed how they saw church, how they interacted with church. It really changed a lot of things. And, well, that's a joke for another day, I guess. But the moral of what I'm saying is, yesterday this church did great things. But today it's time for this church to do great things. When I talk to people, it concerns me that this church is not known as a church of compassion. That bothers me. Most of the time I talk to people about this church, you say, what church is that? Since I've gotten here, these are the things that people have said about this church. Oh, that's the church with the burned orange sign. One thing. Other thing I heard, that's a church next to that field, right? Other thing I've heard, is that the church with the school? No, that's the one over on Sycamore. My point being this, nobody that I was talking to that doesn't go here talked about this being the church that did something for anybody. It was always something related to yesterday, like an old burnt sign by the road, like a field. What's that field there for? Well, we had the hope and idea that we would eventually build a big church there, and this would be the gymnasium. Yesterday's vision. See what I mean? It was that's the only thing we've been tied in for. And I say this to our shame, because this isn't the only church that does this. With the different pastors and stuff that I've worked with around really the whole Southwest, there is this tendency that we hit of, we start off good, just like any organization or business would do, and you have something strong, something worth doing. And then you lose sight of that, and you just kind of coast. And you live off yesterday's vision, and you don't dream again. So then it stops being a thing about seeing people saved, seeing God doing something in somebody's life, and it becomes a thing of, am I comfortable with that? And your whole perception changes what you're really striving for. If you stop being productive today, tomorrow it becomes unproductive. And then you get a new legacy of not having a vision, of being lazy. So the lesson the guy learned in the story, I don't think he learned a very good lesson about yesterday's victory. He looked at yesterday's victory and said, yeah, that's good. So the lesson from this is to hoard what I've got in comfort rather than invest it. And he missed the whole idea here. And this is something that applies to time, health, wealth, possessions. Whenever we talk about this kind of stuff, people get hung up about money. Money is important, but I mean, it's really not that important as far as things. What's important is the mindset behind how you use the money. I've seen a lot of people who have money that throw money at homeless people just so that they can feel good about themselves. Oh, here's a homeless person, just give them some money so leave me alone. Well, the heart there isn't good. See what I mean? And that's really what it goes to, is what's going on in the heart. Meanwhile, I've seen people who didn't even give a single dime, that their heart was in the right place. And I'm not just talking about homeless, I'm talking about church too. We'll take up an offering for something, and they won't give a single dime. And their heart is in a better place than the one who gave all kinds of money. See, it's not about the money. It's about where the money came from, what the mindset is there. So a couple of things that before we move on to the second question that's important for the story is, did you notice, because these details are oftentimes missed, did you notice that the guy in the story, the rich fool, that he already had storage? Did you notice that? He wasn't building storage. He was tearing down his storage and building bigger storage. Okay, that's the first detail that is oftentimes lost. The second one is this. He had no forethought for the future. He wasn't building the storage to store and prepare for the next season. He was building the bigger storage so as to coast. I'm not going to do that anymore. I'm going to have a big enough storage where I can keep it all in there and I won't have to do anything anymore. It wasn't to plan for the future. It was to coast and just get by. Dangerous place to be in. I mean, us men, we know, you know what I'm talking about. What happens when you retire from your job? You sit at your house and you're bored. You twiddle your thumbs and you just want to get out. We men are made for action. Okay, well, we're made to be out there doing stuff, you know. And our legacy is not something that we did yesterday. It's something that carries on. So it's the second question that comes up. Does that mean that your legacy dies with you? If your legacy is nothing more than what you're doing now, doesn't that mean that when you die, your legacy is gone? And that's a good question. To look at that, we're going to have to read two different verses. So hold on. The first one is verse 20. The second one is verse 21. But God said to him, "You fool, this very night your life is demanded of you. And the things you have prepared, whose will they be? That's how it is with the one who stores up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God." So he's not attacking the idea of planning here at all, is he? I think there's two things that he's saying here. The first thing that I think he's saying is in verse 20, where he said about how, whose will it be after you? And the main idea here is that what we prepare on earth will pass to another. Whatever we prepare for on earth, you with kids know exactly what I'm talking about. What you prepare for on earth will pass to another. And I'm not just talking about money here. Not just talking about inheritance. The things that you do, haven't you noticed how much they affect your kids? Your insecurities, haven't you noticed how much they impact your kids? Your character flaws, haven't you noticed how much they impact your kids? Sometimes I feel like my kids just follow me around and see every bad thing I do, and then that's the thing that they do. It drives me crazy. I swear I do some good things every once in a while, but you wouldn't know it as a parent because you feel like everything's just always about what you do bad. But what we prepare for on earth will pass to another. And two things that bother me about that is, first off, what happens if the thing that you prepared goes to an unintended recipient? What happens if you make a business out of your own two hands, and then when you die, it doesn't go to your kids, it goes to some guy down the street who doesn't respect the vision of the business that you started, and the business goes just to the dirt? What do you do then? What do you do if you save up all your money all your life and you're getting ready to die? You give an inheritance to your children, and your child doesn't know the cost of things. They don't appreciate what things cost, and you have a wasteful heir. What happens then? What we prepare on earth will pass. We want to take it with us, but we won't. We won't take anything with us. Naked we came into this life, naked we'll go. But obviously, once again, this is not just about wealth or belongings. What about your name? When people think of you, what do they think of? Do they think of a person of patience and compassion? Over at Waymaker, is the church there on Sunset, on South Sunset. It's pastored by Joel Wood. Most of you guys know him. Joel Wood's dad was not a pastor, but he acted very caring and compassionate to people, and he was like a pastor. That, in turn, impacted not just Joel, but his brother, and they both became pastors, one in Raton, one here in Roswell. Now they're both at Waymaker in Roswell. But you see what I'm saying here? The legacy is what I'm talking about. It's more than just your money. It's about your name. Knowledge and wisdom, they continue to pass from old to young, don't they? There's some things that I think, well, I got this figured out. And then some old guy will come along and say, if you do it like this, it's a lot better. And I think, I didn't even think about that. Do you know why? Because I'm not there yet. I'm still a young buckaroo. And then the second thing that I think he's saying here is not just that what we prepare on earth will pass to another, but I think he's also saying that what we invest in heaven will be there for us. Look at the way he says this in verse 21. That's how it is with the one who stores up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God. He's contrasting here. Not rich toward God. So if you read through chapter 12 of Luke, Jesus talks about a number of different things. In verses 1 through 3, for instance, he talks about the title of the Pharisees and how that's going to go away, how it's going to come to light. In verse 12, he talks about knowledge and how your knowledge is not going to be sufficient, so you need the help of the Holy Spirit. In verses 16 through 20, he talks about the way that our belongings and wealth will pass. In verses 22 through 26, he talks about food and clothing and time, and how you can't even increase these things by worrying about them, so why bother with worrying about it? None of these things will stand the test of time. None of these things are worth consuming us. But these are all the things that we get consumed with in life. Our titles, our knowledge, our belongings and our wealth, our food, our clothing, our time. That's all we tend to think about. But none of those things matter in the grand scheme of things, and we're going to lose all of it. Do you think when we get to heaven, we're going to be able to say, I was once the pastor of a church. I was once the president of the United States. No, he's going to say, well done, good and faithful servant. Not pastor. Not president. Servant. None of these things will stand the test of time. Our knowledge will die with us. For all that we know, we can pass some on, but you know that you can't take everything from your head and insert it in somebody else's head. Then there's the issue that some people just have to learn the hard way. So the issue here is not with wealth. The issue here is not with planning. The issue here is not being rich with God. So the meaning being that he planned for the immediate future, not the eternal future. The point here is to plan for the eternal. He acted with no regard of the implications. I'm going to tear down my storage. I'm going to do this. It's my stuff. I can do whatever I want with my stuff. But what will happen when you do that? If you make your whole point in life striving for what will make you comfortable, what happens when you die? There is no legacy. Your legacy is what you're doing now. What you're doing now. And who knows, maybe he had a lot of good reasons to hoard, It was his stuff anyways. Maybe he was afraid of the future. Maybe he was just tired of working. We've all been there. Maybe he was apathetic towards others. He looked at others and said, hey, I earned my wealth. They can earn their wealth too. Maybe he was apathetic towards God. Yeah, God doesn't really care, He gave me this stuff to use as I see fit, so I'm going to. But our legacy is not something you leave behind. It's not some vain pursuit of having a good name. It's not some vain pursuit of having a building done in your honor. It's not look at all the good deeds I've done. And it's definitely not having a plaque on a building either. Those things aren't your legacy. Your legacy, as we looked at last week, is what you're doing now, but I think we can actually take another step forward and maybe add something on the end of that. Our legacy is what you're doing now for eternity. For eternity. And the thing about that, well, I'll come back to that. Let me just say this. That means the people that you impact in life, that means the service that you give to God, and that means the eternal rewards that you're building up in heaven. I was looking at my books the other day, and you know how much I love my books. I was standing in front of my bookshelves and looking at my books and thinking, man, what a good collection of books. And then the thought creeped into my head, and none of them will survive the next 100 years. Probably. Maybe one will make it 150 years, you never know. But, they're not going to stand the test of time. Even if they do last 200 years. And then what? Eventually, it's going to die and burn anyways. But the thing about our legacy and planning for the eternal is that sometimes that means planting seeds on earth with something you leave here. Not giving here to build a legacy here, but in building your legacy in heaven, leaving something here. Why do we take up an offering for the Wests? It's not eternal. No, that building's not eternal, absolutely. But sometimes you use temporary wealth on temporary things to build the eternal. What's the reason is what it really comes down to. And you really have to see things in perspective, I think, is the issue that we all struggle with. You have wealth, why? So I can live comfortably? No. You have wealth so that you can show Christ's love to others. Why do you get out of debt? You get out of debt so that you don't have to worry so much about that, and instead you can focus on others. Debt exists in your life because you're not thinking about others. Debt exists in your life because you're thinking about yourself. And that's hard because we live in a very, very expensive culture. So whenever you start talking about this, people say, no, I'm in debt because things are so expensive. So change your spending. Change your spending. You don't have to be a slave to the things that you want. You can live free. But oftentimes we look at the things that we have as this is so that God has given me this so that I can relax now. I have enough money now. Now I don't have to worry. Money doesn't take away worry. It only adds to it. I've been poor and I've been rich in my life. I've been both. And never was I so satisfied as when I was poor. I actually know a pastor who was offered a certain amount of money at a church and he turned it down and took much less. Because if you can live off of it, why hoard it? What's the point of that? When you give an inheritance to your children, it's oftentimes a curse. You give them this thing that they didn't earn, and they have to struggle with it. They get themselves in debt. They have a lot of problems. But giving a godly inheritance, that's something that's priceless. That's something that extends far beyond the grave. Dave Chappelle, the comedian, was telling this story about how he said, I hate being poor. And his father made this comment. He said, you aren't poor, son. Poor is a mindset. And that story has always stuck with me because it's so much more than the money. It's a mindset. Your legacy is something you leave in heaven where it belongs. Your legacy in that aspect is a bridge to the eternal. The things you're doing now that matter for eternity, that's a bridge to the eternal. It's a bridge to your eternity. And let me kind of build on that, okay? It's the difference between feeding poor people in Africa versus feeding poor people in Africa to show Christ's love. How do you know the difference? Nobody else does. Nobody else does. You know the difference. You know the difference. When you're doing something to prove that you're good enough, when you're doing something because it's the right thing to do, when you're doing something because you honor and respect God, you know the difference in your heart. You know. No, other people will be fooled. They'll be fooled with your facade, with how you look, how you dress, all those things. But you'll know at the end of the day, and God will too. It's not about just giving. After you give, praying, caring, going when you can. See, our possessions are a means to an end. And once again, this applies to so much more than money. All of our earthly things that we have, that we treasure so much, it's a means to an end. It's not the end in of itself. It's a means to love others. It's a means to serve God. It's a means to invest in eternal rewards. Now, last week we were talking about Job's wife and how she became kind of the biggest hindrance to him. For Job's wife, integrity, doing the right thing, being a person of upstanding was a means of gain. That's all it was for her. And she sucked off of his good name. For this rich fool in the story, his gains were for self. But for us, integrity itself is great riches. Having the right name, doing the right thing, even when nobody notices, even when nobody knows you did it, that is a great gain. Those are great riches. And that's worth building up in heaven. Not so that you can get noticed and patted on the back. It's fine if people notice you and pat you on the back. But when you do something to get noticed and patted on the back, that's different. And the last thing I want to say about this before we wrap things up. Our earthly gains plant the crops at heaven's gates. Our earthly gains plant the crops at heaven's gates. What we do matters extremely. With our money, with our time, with our name, with everything we have, our belongings, our children. Your time is limited. But what are you doing today in light of eternity? That's your legacy. That's your legacy. And when you die, it doesn't die with you because you've built in a home that doesn't go away. It's not like your house that you live in now that will one day turn into dust. It's something that moth can't eat, rust can't destroy. That's our legacy. We as a church will continue pushing forward in missions. We'll continue pushing forward to love and serve Roswell because that is what we're here for. That's our legacy. That's what we're doing now. Please join me in prayer. we're going to do prayer in two parts. And part one is going to be this. Right here at your seat, right now, nobody's going to know what you're thinking about or anything. You don't have to stand up and proclaim it to the church. But right where you're at is, right now is a perfect time for you to get in tune with God. Take just a moment and ask God and talk to God. What has God trusted you to use? And are you using it? Using money is great, but we're not just talking about money. We're talking about life. And life is so much more than money. What has God trusted you to use, and are you using it? Right now at your seat, this is the time to pray and ask God. God, what have you given me in life? And am I using it? It's easy to look at the things you don't have, but God has given each of us something. What has He given you? And what can you use now? Lord, please speak to our hearts. We're just going to give this a minute. This is between you and God. Lord, speak to our hearts. Show us what you've given us. And Lord, prompt us if we're not using it. Not just the obvious things like money, but the things that we overlook. Now, obviously, this prayer is going to probably be a series of prayers between you and God. But what's important is you start it now. We're going to move things forward here. If you want to stay at your seats and continue to pray about that, that's fine. If you'd rather leave, that's fine. But if you just need prayer for anything, come up to the front. We're going to pray for you. We want to open up the altars. If there's anything right now you need prayer for, whether it's healing or just direction or really anything you're going through in life, if you just need prayer, this is what the body of Christ is here for, to love and serve each other, to love and serve others. If you need prayer, don't put it off.